Like the big debate as we head into the budget, one of the big debates is, well, we've got all this big surplus, but be careful not to spend it because it may feed inflation. One thing I would just like, because I think it should be said, if you think it's true, but certainly most of the sort of economists or whatever acknowledge it, but it's rarely sort of stated up front, and I personally think it should be, if you agree, is that it is okay to spend more if you cover it on the other side by increased revenues. In other words, if we decide we desperately need to spend more on housing, we desperately need to put more into the health service, we desperately need to protect the less well-off from the impacts of inflation, you can spend more, and it is financially acceptable, if you like, from a prudential point of view, to do so, as long as you cover it on the other side by increasing revenues through, for example, raising taxes on wealth or on the super profits that are being earned and that indeed, to a significant extent, as you're acknowledging, are driving inflation. So isn't it important to just acknowledge that fact? Because it rarely is. It's always about, we got to be careful about spending. Shouldn't we say, we got to be careful about spending if you don't know that you're going to raise additional revenues to cover it? But if you raise additional revenues that possibly reduce, let's say, less important demand, it isn't a problem. You know, if we stopped the demand for yachts, luxury yachts, that wouldn't be a bad thing, would it? Because there wasn't then more money available for people with houses, do you know what I mean? Or the demand for very expensive champagne, or the demand for swimming pools in people's houses. They would, you know, so there's different types of demand, let's put it that way. And shouldn't we just be a little bit, spell that out a little bit more?
So I won't comment directly on yachts, but maybe I'll say two things in response to your question. One, I would think there's two elements to the restrained spending right now. Probably most acute is feeding the inflation that you spoke about, the capacity constraints, but the other element is vulnerability and ensuring the public finances is not put on a firm foot structurally, that we don't start to use potentially transitory receipts to feed expenditure. But to come back to your main point, the net spending rule that was designed in the Summer Economic Statement of 2021 is net spending. It is to exactly your point. If you raise revenues, you can do more spending. It just means net of balance of revenues and expenditure, the growth is 5%. So exactly as you're outlining, we would be saying within that structure, the 5% rule is the right guidance. It is a government's decision, those relativities across policies in terms of how that spending versus tax revenue is done. But to your point, yes, that would still keep us on it.
Yeah, I just think it's important to stress, and it's not in the language, and I just think it should be emphasised a little bit more. It often just seems like, you know, because, I mean, the problem from the point of view of ordinary working people and those on lower incomes and so on is when we budget deficits, they have to get it in the neck, and when we've record budget surpluses, they still get it in the neck. But meanwhile, you know, the super profits being earned. And at least it should be, I'm not asking you to agree with my particular policy proposals, but that at least it is seen as a legitimate option to say, well, actually, there is a way you can prevent the austerity or restraint on those who really need it if you can raise additional revenues from elsewhere. Do you know what I mean?
So, yeah. So from a macro perspective, it is the net point. So I agree with you. The decisions in between, whether it's yacht, champagne or anything else, I'll leave for others to decide. But it is all about this. The macro stability requires the total demand is kept at a capped level, essentially.
Can I just a couple of other points again, which I just think are worth clarifying in this debate and see what you think. I mean, capacity constraints are being mentioned quite a lot. And a big factor, a major factor, possibly the major one, but again, I'd be interested in your opinion, is we're talking about labour shortages and skills shortages. And it's a bit of a chicken and egg, you might accept, because, you know, I met a group of teachers today who were saying there's loads of people out there who want to be teaching. We've got a shortage of teachers, But because they can't get permanent posts, and because on the earnings that they will get as a teacher, they can't afford to live in Dublin, they're leaving the country. So that's a chicken and egg. Because if you don't give them decent wages, and if you don't give them housing that they can afford, all of which require spending, then they're going to leave, and your capacity constraints, your labour shortages get worse. So, you know, I think we do have to kind of like address that problem. I mean, again, maybe we need less people working building luxury yachts. No, I'm using that as an extreme example, but more people working in our schools to educate our children, because that's actually a prudential investment in our society. I mean, is that a reasonable...
So the way I would describe what you're saying is, within that net rule we've talked about, there's current spending and there's capital spending. And capital spending, I think, is speaking to what you were talking about. And there is potential to increase the capacity of the economy going forward if you deal with infrastructural spending, for example. The reality is, given the size of the shocks, to restore people's real incomes, to avoid a fiscal drag in terms of the tax system, and to do capital spending, it is just too much spending for where the economy is at right now. And the tough choices are between those, because there is a need to support households. Without doubt, some of them has experienced huge increases in cost of living. And to the earlier point, and maybe I didn't come across right here, I didn't want to be dismissive that people with mortgages have higher income. They also could have very high costs and could be the most acutely affected. So it's about identifying those households, but it's getting the balance right between that and doing capital spending to unlock infrastructure, to support the provision of housing, for example, which increases the potential for more people to come into the state, to provide the labour, to stop people leaving the state, as you've pointed out. So it is about getting that mix right. But again, there are trade-offs inherent across all of that and getting that balance correct. Yeah,
and last point, it just sort of follows on from that one though, but again, I just feel it's worth spelling out that, one of the big sort of ongoing current expenditures that's ballooning is the amount of money the state every year is forking out in HAPs, RAS and leasing arrangements. And you could probably say the same about some of the outsourcing to the private sector of healthcare is also probably another, maybe it doesn't get talked about as much. But if we do increased spending and increased investment, that reduces that ongoing and in some cases ballooning current expenditure by bringing down over the medium to long term the cost of housing by investing directly in public and affordable housing, that is, is it fair to say that's a prudential expenditure, even if we're significantly increasing it, because it's actually going to reduce our our financial kind of exposure, if you like, over the medium to long term.
I can see exactly. So basically what you're saying is you trade off future current expenditure by doing the capital expenditure now. Yeah. I think rationally, from an economics point of view, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. However, it still meets this point of the capacity constraints of the economy. If you don't have construction workers, it is very hard to deliver X thousand more houses. And if we try to do it, we run the risk that what we'll do is we will push up the cost of supplying those houses, and we won't actually get good value for the state for its capital spending. That is potentially the issue here. So it is about finding that balance. Like, I think from an economic standpoint, if you a clear map, you would say, yes, of course, investing in provision of more social housing would mean you can lower current expenditure in the future. But it's about getting the balance right now to ensure what we don't do is actually create bad value for money in terms of that capital spending.